Good evening, and I would like to welcome everyone to tonight's informal Community Safety and Environment Policy and Accountability Committee meeting. My name is Councillor Borough, and I am the chair of the committee. The meeting is being held informally this evening to allow us to continue to meet remotely while COVID remains a public health risk. And I'd just like to add that I hope everyone attending and watching is in the best of health possible, and that you're all keeping somewhat cool, or as cool as you can, in tonight's quite warm weather. I would like to remind all participants of a few housekeeping points. So, as I'm sure you're all aware, it would be helpful if you could please keep your microphones muted unless you're speaking, to help cut down on background noise. And when prompted, you may indicate you wish to speak, but please wait until I call on you before speaking fully. If you could use the raise hand function, that would be the best, but otherwise, if you're having an issue doing that, then you can feel free to just try and catch my attention by speaking. If any of the councillors leave the meeting or lose connection during an item, we will be able to pause and wait a few minutes for them to reconnect. Now, item 1 is apologies for absence, but we haven't received any apologies for absence this evening. And I will then go on to item 2, which is declarations of interest. Do any of the members have any declarations of interest that they need to declare this evening? Councillor Fiona Smith.
Just worth saying that I'm Vice Chair of Licensing, and I know a couple of licensing points are going to come up. I think that should mean that I can speak, but obviously shouldn't make any firm sort of policy recommendations as a result. If we're content with that, I think I'm fine to contribute.
Yes, I believe that's fine.
Okay.
That's noted. Okay, thank you. I will move on to minutes of the previous meeting, which all committee members have had access to. Were there any points arising from the previous minutes of the meeting held on the 16th of March 2021? I don't see anyone indicating that they've got any notes or points of order based on the previous minutes. As tonight's meeting is informal, we will note any changes to be made, but otherwise the minutes will actually have to be formally agreed at our next meeting. Okay, item 4 would be public questions, but we haven't received any public questions in relation to any items on the agenda. And that will now lead me on to item 5, which is the law enforcement team update. So I will ask Matthew Hooper to introduce the item, but would you mind introducing yourself and your position to the committee, and also for the benefit of anyone watching on the live stream this evening? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. So I'm Matthew Hooper. I'm the Chief Officer for Safer Neighbourhoods and Regulatory Services, and community safety falls under my remit, which is where the law enforcement team sits. So if I just share my screen. Now I'm hoping that everyone can see the presentation. Is that right?
I can see it, yes. Yeah. Yeah, it looks like everybody can. Thank you.
Good. Okay. So, as has been asked, we've put together some slides to update on what's happened with the law enforcement team in Hammersmith and Fulham. The team was approved back in December. And very, very quickly, we've managed to pull together a recruitment exercise to fill all of the positions. But the presentation really just focuses on successes so far, where we're up to, what the objectives of the team are, and gives an idea about what the future holds for the team. So, apologies, just having some slight trouble moving to the next slide. Can everyone still see the screen, and can they see it in a way that they can read?
I'm afraid it looks like we've lost the share screen function.
Yeah.
1 second, sorry, I'll just correct that.
It's back.
Good, okay. If you can't read it, please let me know and I'll do what I can to change the size of the slide. But this is just the second slide in the pack. So just as an update, as I've already said, the team was approved on the 7th of December. In total per annum, the investment is £4.6 million, which is the vast majority of which is just in the staff. It's 72 officers that pays for. And it is most definitely the largest community safety investment in the history of Hammersmith and Fulham. And that sits alongside that 4.6 million and those 72 officers, the gangs unit that's already been established, an investment of about £1 million a year. So in terms of the overall community safety officer, it really it really is substantial. Moving on, just to outline the reasons why we believe that the team was necessary, the reasons why we were asked to make the changes. I think first of all, certainly from the resident perspective, it was quite a disjointed approach. So lots of individual teams created for individual reasons that all had individual functions and ways of working. If you're a resident, it's really hard to understand the different teams and what they did and where the boundaries were. So it was something that we felt we needed to correct. The second thing was around having the disparity in operational practices. Because some of those boundaries could sometimes get blurred, where you've got a number of teams in a similar space, it sometimes got quite confusing between those team members, and it took up more time than it needed to in order to complete certain jobs. Also, I suppose it goes without saying with the description I've just given, but they were quite narrowly focused services. So we'd have one team that was focused in parks, for example, would have another team that was predominantly focused in our housing blocks and estates. It was hard to see how they all stitched together from our perspective and from a resident perspective. And then in terms of powers, each of those teams had quite limited powers. All had delegated powers, but they were only able really to use one or two of those at a time, which meant that in terms of their problem-solving ability, each of those teams, it was quite limited. And then just purely from an operational perspective, it made coordinating things and briefing officers, making sure that everyone was on top of what they were supposed to be doing, more challenging from a management perspective, and therefore more expensive. So what have we moved to? This is an outline of the core duties of the law enforcement team. I'll start at the top left. So first and foremost, this gives us the ability to have high visibility patrols everywhere in the borough. And that means 24-hour coverage between Wednesday and Sunday to make sure we cover the busiest periods. The officers are getting their uniforms at the moment. We're having them customised so that they clearly state that it's Hammersmith and Fulham law enforcement team, which is taking a little bit of time, but we expect them to be fully uniformed within the next couple of weeks, which means that there will be no difficulty in identifying them on the street. They'll have peaked hats, they'll have high-vis yellow jackets and dark clothing, and they will have a red and white checker band, which will identify them both on their caps and on their uniform. They will be in parks and open spaces, but the same officers, because we have those increased numbers now, will also be across housing estates and blocks and public spaces. So Shepherd's Bush Green springs to mind, and anywhere else you can think of where there is high footfall, where there might be environmental issues and antisocial behaviour. In terms of legislative tools and powers, the main bits of legislation are contained within the Environmental Protection Act, but also within the ASB Crime and Policing Act, which gives us additional powers to tackle antisocial behaviour specifically. And then because our officers are all accredited under the Metropolitan Police's Community Safety Accreditation Scheme, they have a limited number of police powers, which include things like confiscating alcohol from street drinkers. And it also enables our officers to demand name and address from people who are perpetrating antisocial behaviour. If the perpetrator fails to give it to us, it's an offence that the police can arrest them for. In terms of corporate and partner support, it means that we can generate an awful lot of eyes and ears referrals through to our partner agencies, mainly but not exclusively the police. And hopefully by that way, we pick up on issues before any residents see or hear about them, which will increase feelings of safety, we hope. Also event support, lots of events in the borough. Our officers are trained in how to, for example, direct traffic, as well as how to man a cordon and how to assist police in dealing with a major incident, for example. So that's where we'll be assisting us, blue light services as well. And then obviously the borough have emergency planning responsibilities and duties, and having that team of officers on call at any time means that we have those officers who can actually deal with some of those emergency planning activations. So if we need people on site, if we need people to be highly visible and to assist and reassure members of the public, we have a lot more officers to do that and a far greater capability to do that. And then in terms of problem solving, this is an issue that will be close to councillors' hearts because it will feature in a lot of casework. Part of the function of the team is to, by undertaking that problem solving work, working with the other parts of the council to get long-term solutions to some of those kind of intractable local issues that perhaps have been a problem for communities for years. So we hope that through training the officers properly, they can work with all the different council departments and get better results. And then also they can work to secure funding for design changes. So maybe that might be an alley that needs gating, and maybe some funding needs to be found for that, whether that's from a central government funding pot or from a local government funding pot. But it gives us far greater resilience in trying to resolve some of those local issues. So moving on to where they are in the borough, we have 3 area-based teams which cover 3 main parts of the borough, as you can see here. So the north team, the central team and the south team, divided as hopefully you can see on that map there. And we've given details for all of the senior officers for everyone to be aware of, because we do want people to be contacting the senior officers directly, and for those officers to have that to be known in their local area. So each of these seniors will manage a number of staff. There's a structure chart later on in the PAC. And the dedicated ward officers that patrol the particular wards that are numbered here will be giving their numbers out to residents at local residents meetings, so that they can be contacted, because we want to be available. We want to make sure that we're properly engaging with the community. There's 3 area-based teams, but in total across the whole of the law enforcement team there are 5 teams. So that's the 3 area-based teams, the tasking team, which is about having a flexible resource during the daytime to respond to issues wherever they are in the borough. And then equally, based on the same concept, we have the night team, which is gives us that night cover, again, taskable to anywhere in the borough overnight, as well as responding to things like noise complaints. So moving on to early successes, we've had a number so far, given that we've been operational since April. The most recent being coordinating the removal of the protesters from Shepherd's Bush Green, which was a really significant effort. We didn't do it alone, we did it in conjunction with the High Court enforcement officers and the Central West BCU from the police. But I think everyone is agreed that it was a successful operation, and the results of which have lasted, thankfully. 2 other issues that have sprung up have been the unauthorised traveller encampments. One was in Ravenscourt Park, and the other was on Townmead Road. Now, both of which have the potential to cause lots of concern to the community. In Ravenscourt Park, the encampment was really significant, and the police dealt with that very quickly. And on Townmead Road, the travellers broke into a site that had been fly tipped before, and it actually cost Hammersmith and Fulham several £100,000 to clear the fly tipping. And there was clear evidence that the most recent encampment there were also going to try and fly tip that land. They didn't, and we managed to get them out. Also, one of our staff, very unfortunately, very sadly, received racial abuse from a member of the public. And because the officers have radios, because we're linked up, they could work with CCTV and direct the police to that individual, and they were arrested for that offence. And I think you'll agree that's good news. If someone is prepared to abuse a uniformed member of staff, who knows what else they're doing. And then in relation to environmental offences, smaller issues here, but I think you'll agree they happen, unfortunately, quite all over the borough, quite widespread. And if we can make a difference by issuing tickets to stop people doing these things, such as public urination and fly tipping, then we will discourage people from doing it at all. And then lastly, the last point there, it's a small issue again, but we've had a lot of complaints from people who cycle into the borough that they can't use some of the places where bikes are locked up because there are old or abandoned bicycles tied to them, and we've released some of those to make it easier to cycle into the borough. It all helps. On to performance. So when we started to record formally and the service was fully operational from mid-May, from that point we've received just over 4,000 service requests. So that's sort of council speak for jobs or members of the public asking us to do something. And the ones we've had most reported were, perhaps unsurprisingly, fly tipping. Second, antisocial behaviour of any type, a range of behaviours there. And then the third was park-related issues. So again, antisocial behaviour, but problems occurring in parks. And at the moment, based on those 4,000 complaints, we've got 427 active investigations in the team that we are resolving. And I thought it would be helpful to just set out in very simple terms the objectives of the team in terms of a cleaner Hammersmith and Fulham, about making people feel safer, and about what our commitment is in terms of professionalism to make sure that we can enable those two objectives to be delivered. I won't go through the table, but hopefully people make sense to people watching. Just very briefly now, the last two slides on training. I wanted to make it really clear that all of our staff, because we had an opportunity, and it was very much a one-time only opportunity. When you've got a new team in who aren't expected to patrol yet, you have time and space to properly train those members of staff to make sure that they have the best knowledge when they're doing their jobs, and that they have the best attitude and approach to their jobs. So we're really pleased that we've managed to encourage a number of people from the hospitality industry into the team. So they have a very resident focused approach, a very customer service focused approach. And the four key pillars of the training were, first and foremost, the corporate induction, so they understand the organisation, what we do, and the different parts of it, in some depth, I should add. The community safety accreditation scheme training, which covers a lot of ground in relation to how to take enforcement action, how to deal with people that are being difficult, how to take notes, for example, to a legal standard, and how to present in court as well. The third one, safeguarding, absolutely critical, child and adult safeguarding, and in addition to that, some of the detailed issues like modern slavery and exploitation and violence against women and girls were included in the training as well. And then also, because they'll be doing a lot of work with the police and the fire brigade, among others, they've had detailed partner agency briefings about how to work with them and how they can best support them. And there'll be an ongoing training plan throughout the life of the team that we're currently compiling, because our aim is to have the most professional and well qualified service in London, as well as the largest. The structure chart, just finally, really just there for information. Just wanted people to be aware of how things were set up and what numbers we were talking about. Chair, thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much. Okay, we will go to members for questions. Can I just start by asking, do the new law enforcement teams replace what we previously knew as parks police and estate wardens?
Yes, they do. So rather than those teams, yeah, the functions of those teams are now combined into the law enforcement team. So yes, that is the answer to the question.
And did we, in the recruitment, do we actually have people, team members who've moved over from their previous position? So we've had a sort of continuation of personnel, or have all the team members who recruited been new recruits to the borough and to the programme?
Some have, but I think there were 30 staff who were possibly to be transferred, but they had the option to select whether they went into the new team, and I think in total 14 did.
Okay. Councillor Brocklebank-Fowler, I'll come to you.
Thank you, Chairman. Matthew, could you just go over the section again as to what powers these people have?
So they have powers under the Environmental Protection Act. So that includes powers to issue fines, fixed penalties for fly tipping, littering, abandoned vehicles, works on the highway. They have powers under highway obstruction, so they can similarly issue a notice for highway obstruction. And they can issue a community protection warning and notice under the ASB Crime and Policing Act. And then under the CSAS accreditation, they can demand, as I've already said, they can demand name and address if someone is perpetrating antisocial behaviour, but they can also confiscate cigarettes and alcohol from people. They can confiscate alcohol from people if it is a public space protection order, which controls the consumption of alcohol. It is a long list, and it's something that can be provided rather than me sort of going through it on the call, if that's okay.
Well, yes, I'd be grateful if you could email me a full list of their powers. Just moving on quickly, the uniform is quite kind of, well, I don't know, paramilitary, or I don't know quite how you describe it, but a few residents have said to me that they found it, you know, rather off-putting. I haven't seen it myself, but this was in the park, and I think people were surprised at the uniform. How did you work out what would make someone, you know, approachable, but with authority? I mean, it's a fine balance.
Yeah, so I think we started by looking at all the other local authorities who have any kind of enforcement team to speak to them and look at their uniforms, see what the kind of prevailing trends were, if you like, across local authorities. And we thought about colour schemes, we thought about the corporate colours. I would add, Councillor, that whatever uniform that the resident has seen and told you about is not going to be the final uniform. None of the staff are currently in their full uniform. They are in a temporary uniform of they have a vest which says Hammersmith and Fulham Law Enforcement Officer on it, so that they can be identifiable. But by the end of this month, beginning of next, all our staff should be in the new corporate uniform, which is fairly straightforward in that it will be a peaked cap with the Hammersmith and Fulham badge on it, and the red and white checker band, and a high-vis jacket, and the rest of the clothing, a white shirt. The rest of the clothing is dark clothing.
Right, okay. Are there other boroughs in London who have combined all these different individual council departments?
There are one or two. The London Borough of Newham has taken a very similar approach, as has the London Borough of Croydon. They're two that I can think of. I know that Tower Hamlets is a very active law enforcement team as well. So I think every council has taken a slightly different approach. I don't think I can say faithfully that each of them has done exactly as it's taken the same approach that we've taken. But it's certainly been done. And you know, I come from Newham Council. I ran the team at Newham Council, you know, I like to think that they were a successful team.
Thank you.
I'll come to Councillor Rosenberg next.
Thank you. How far does what you do overlap with the noise nuisance team? That's the first thing. And the second is, how mobile are you in terms of response? Because very often there are incidents which need a fairly quick response when people ring up to complain, either be alarmed or whatever. But is it something which somebody can pick up a phone, ring you up and say, there's a problem? How quickly can you respond?
Thank you, Councillor. So the first thing I'd say is the team wasn't designed to be a response service, but they are out and about in the borough, you know, almost all the time. They will have electric vehicles to travel around the borough. And so our ability to respond to issues that need to be responded to is going to be very quick. We should always, the vast majority of the time, have responses there to deal with those issues. In terms of the overlap with the noise and nuisance team, there isn't really an overlap. But what I would say is, you know, because we've got a night team that gives us that 24-hour capability, it makes a lot more sense for initial noise complaints. So the noisy parties where there isn't an ongoing neighbour dispute. It makes sense for the law enforcement team to respond to those, which leaves our qualified noise and nuisance team to respond to the more intractable noise issues, the ones that have been going on for a long amount of time, the ones that involve a licensed premises, for example. So we are using the law enforcement team to respond or to make us more responsive to noise and nuisance calls.
For instance, if somebody is concerned about maybe something to do with children or domestic abuse late in the day, is it appropriate that they should contact you?
No, Councillor. So if it's a child safeguarding issue, if it is a domestic abuse issue, then it should always be the police, because they're able to respond to that most effectively.
Thank you.
Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the presentation. It was very helpful. I will say you strayed into a danger zone in terms of an issue that's come up in this committee, not for a long time, but it came up before, and it's something I've had at least one or two residents contact me about. You mentioned the idea of clearing abandoned bicycles from places where they're stored, you know, the various Sheffield stands and other storage stands across the borough. My impression is that we are very bad as a local authority at doing this. I'm aware of bicycles that have been abandoned for 3 to 4 years, i.e. abandoned frames that will sit on Shepherd's Bush Green for 2, 3, 4 years. And I know they've been there 2 or 3, 4 years, as I've had residents tell me, and the evidence is in Google Street View. I've passed links to Street View. In one instance, bikes sat in Shepherd's Bush Green for 3 years and were only removed when the paving stones were ripped up around them and the Sheffield stands were removed to be cleaned. How do these get reported? How does the system work? What are the kind of timescales we operate on? I know obviously residents can report it, whether it's email, Cleaner Greener app or whatever else, but what kind of proactive work is done? Because certainly in high traffic areas like Shepherd's Bush Green, outside Westfield tube stations, residents are not going to feel comfortable leaving bikes if obviously stands look as if they're full of kind of abandoned bits of wheel and frame and things like this. How proactive are we, and what kind of timescales do we aim to operate on when these things do get raised with officers?
We're working on pulling together the detailed sort of response to these issues. My ambition is that we'll be able to respond to these calls within 48 hours. But in relation to that specific issue, you know, when members of the public, our residents, have clearly been calling it through to the council, and the council switchboard now know to put it through to us as an issue to deal with, because we thought it was a nice easy start for the officers in terms of an operation across the borough. We've actually equipped them all with angle grinders and given them the proper training in how to use them in terms of health and safety, so that they can remove those bikes as part of day-to-day duties. So as I say, working towards resolving these within 48 hours after the call is received, which I think most people would agree is quite a good service. So yeah, it's, you know, it's obviously something that people care about.
I mean, that obviously the response time for when they're reported, that's very helpful. And it's good to hear that officers have kind of been trained in trying to deal with it. Is that going to be a sort of proactive part of their work now, in the sense that even without residents raising it, if these officers are out and about and they see, outside a tube station, there's a couple of old bikes that are clearly, abandoned, how proactive would they be? Because certainly one of the issues that's come up in the past is I've had some slightly kind of wishy-washy responses from officers where understandably they're nervous about removing a bicycle that it does belong to somebody. It might look a bit shabby, but in reality it's a perfectly serviceable bike, and I know they can be worried about pulling away a bike that somebody owns and uses. But at the same time, there were times where the bike's clearly unusable, and yet officers were reluctant or didn't feel confident in thinking, no, actually, this is clearly just now rubbish, we can pick it up. I mean, how enabled are officers to act on this thing? If they see a bike that looks clearly abandoned, are they going to have the confidence and the support of the senior officers to be like, no, this is getting removed now?
So from our perspective, it's very much the same as an abandoned vehicle, and there's a test for an abandoned vehicle. So you would look for a number of things, and on a bike it would be flat tires, rusted rims, does it have a seat? As you say, is it a usable bicycle? Yes, the officers will do it proactively, so we aren't going to wait for a call. If we see a rusty old bike, maybe the wheels are missing, we're going to get that removed. Yeah, I mean, it's an easy fix for us to do that now, and we're equipped to do it early on. And if we do accidentally remove a bike that someone wants, all we're going to do is take that bike to storage for a period of time. So the chances are they'll be able to reclaim it.
Thanks very much. That's very helpful and hopefully quite positive.
Thank you. I just wanted to come back, particularly with regard to Councillor Brockbanks Fowler's question earlier regarding the uniforms. So from what I understand, obviously the law enforcement team are going to be highly visible on the streets of the borough whilst they're working, and I think there possibly is going to be some confusion as to who they are, sort of what they do, and particularly I've been contacted myself by a couple of people with relation to their work in parks, for example. They hadn't been aware that the Parks Police had sort of become part of the new team. Is there going to be any sort of communication or publicity regarding who these new teams are, and that people can expect to see them out and about, and also what they look like? Because I think that the establishing them as a sort of recognisable force will actually help their work, and also be important, because I think otherwise people may confuse them for private security, for example, that belongs to a company or a property, as opposed to actually working with the council.
Yes, so because they haven't got their full uniforms yet, we haven't done an official launch with a communication plan. That communication plan is written though, and once we've got the uniforms, then we'll be in a position to kick that communication plan off, make sure people are aware of their identity, make sure they know how to contact them, and broadly what their powers are. Originally we'd wanted to have the vehicles before we launched, but because of there's a supply issue in relation to electric vehicles, so we're not going to have them till sort of October, November time at the earliest. But yes, communication plan written and ready to go.
Okay. And will that include maybe, for example, speaking to schools, or at least sort of being aware and sending the communications to schools? I can understand that not recognising the uniform, not knowing who they are if they speak to teenagers or so on, or school teachers. I think that might be quite important, particularly in terms of antisocial behaviour. They may sort of come across students that they need to speak to, but there will be a confusion as to who they are.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And because of the proximity to a number of schools to our parks and open spaces, we've seen that as really important. But it's also part of that wider engagement. So it's not just a comms plan. These officers have been told that they need to be visible friendly, and they need to, you know, go and speak to people so that people understand who they are and what they do, as well as what we do centrally to communicate who they are.
And then just one final question before I go back to Councillor Rosenberg. In terms of the working closely with the local police and the borough command unit, how will that work? Will it just be on a call basis, or will there actually be some sort of longer term strategic work going on, particularly with sort of larger local issues? I know you said there are certain incidents where you've worked together closely already, but I think it would also help establish some confidence in the new teams that you're working closely with the police, and there's some legal law enforcement as well as local law enforcement.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So there are going to be two main tasking processes for the team. The first is going to be our monthly tasking process, which is run by the council, which will be where we look at all the data that we've got available to us in relation to what residents are complaining about, what they're telling us about, so that we can put together a list of work, a contract of work, if you like, for the next 4 weeks for all of the law enforcement team. And that's something that obviously we're going to do every month. So that's to make sure we're addressing the issues that matter most to residents. But then in addition to that, there's going to be a strategic problem solving meeting, which will be with the police, that will do exactly as you say, and look at some of those longer term issues and how we can work with the police to resolve some of those. So we've got a really good working relationship with the police on this. The police have bought fully into the new service. They've approved the uniform, for example. So yes, that is going to be a key part of their work, making sure that we work hand in hand with the blue light services.
Great, thank you very much. Councillor Rosenberg.
Right. How do you plan to communicate with the residents of the borough? Because there always seems to be a gap when people don't seem to know what's going on. And are you intending to emphasise that you are working with the police, but you are not the police?
Yes, so as I've said, the communication plan will take account of all the different communication channels that we need to use, whether that's via social media, whether that's on the website, and the staff will be out and about in the local areas, speaking to residents. In time, they'll be attending residents' meetings as well. So, you know, we think that by communicating centrally, as I say, using social media and all the different channels that the comms team have access to, and the staff being as visible as they will be and as you know, engaging as they will be with the local community, we'll get through to the most people. And then in relation to the police, yes, of course, you know, we are not the police. We don't have the same powers as the police, and there is no overlap there. But you know, recognise that we need to let people know what it is we can deal with. We're going to have some very clear website pages that set out what the team deal with, set out our performance, that show where we're patrolling. Each of the offices is going to have a GPS radio. So if residents say, well, I don't see them, we can say, well, this is where they've been patrolling in the last 24 hours, 48 hours, the last week or month. So by using the website, we hope we can make it a really transparent service and people can understand what it is that they're actually doing.
Is there any way that there could be some kind of a local app so people can track you or track where you are?
Well, I suppose it's possible. I think, you know, I'm not sure how useful that would be. From my perspective, trying to operationally manage these staff, you know, it's critical that they have those GPS-enabled radios. They'll also have body-worn video cameras, so anything that they see or encounter, they can turn their video on, and they'll have footage of that encounter. But the radios mean that at any given point, we've got software in our control room, in the CCTV control room at 43 Beaver Lane, which shows where all the officers are on the borough at any one time. And if we task them to go somewhere, we can watch in real time as they make progress to the tasked area, which gives us real confidence that those officers are where they should be, when they should be, doing exactly what they've been asked. Because the one thing we've been clear with the team and the management is that there will be no room for error in relation to operational deployment. We need to have absolute command and control of these officers at all time. It's such a big investment that we can't allow any slack to be built into that system.
I think it would give local people an enormous sense of security if there was some way that they could actually contact the team if an incident occurs. Because that's always been the issue, that they've tried to get through on the phone and they can't. So if there is some way that your team can actually build links with communities so that they can feel confident that they've got, you know, the Bobby on the beat, if you like, the local policeman on the corner, that, but, you know, one of you who they can contact if they need to.
Yeah, and what, as I've said, what I hope the officers will be doing, what they'll be asked to do is, for residents that have concerns, if they see them walking down the street, they can ask that officer for their telephone number, their direct, you know, mobile phone number, and they can speak to them that way when they're on the shift. And then when they've got an issue that they want the council to respond to, or law enforcement team to respond to, they can, in the usual way, phone that through to the council switchboard. They can email it through. And that'll get through to us, and then if staff are on shift, we'll be able to respond to it. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you.
Councillor Brocklebank-Fowler.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Matthew, I was going to ask about the body camera, which you've just answered. They don't carry a truncheon or... No,
sorry, Councillor. I think the audio went there. Absolutely not. No, they don't. They won't carry CS gas, a truncheon, or anything of that kind.
Okay, fine. And just out of interest, did you manage to recruit mainly from residents in the borough?
We certainly attempted to recruit a lot of residents. We went via all of the local channels to try and get people to apply. I think in the end, we don't have a huge number of residents working in the team. I think it might be 2 or 3. But over time, perhaps that's something that we can address. You know, we really want people from the local area to be working in the team, people who know the borough and care about the borough.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think that I've had all the questions from committee members on that. So in which case, thank you very much, Matthew. We will move on to the next item, which is the improving private sector housing through discretionary property licensing. And I will invite Ed Shaler to introduce this item.
Yes, good evening, councillors, and good evening, members of the public who may be watching. I'm just trying to get my video to start, but it doesn't seem to want to, so forgive me for that. I will. I think it's now working.
Back now, yeah.
Yeah. So good evening. So I haven't got any slides to present. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes to the reports, which is in your agenda pack, and then invite any questions that you might have. So by way of just explaining the content of the report, there's a proposal to renew the council's landlord licensing scheme from next year, where landlords of houses and flats of certain types will have to apply for and pay for a license from the council, which will have various conditions attached to it. So just by way of background, the private rented sector in Hammersmith and Fulham is one of the largest in London and indeed in the country. We think it's the 8th highest in the country. Our data is, of course, now about 10 years old from the last census, and we're eagerly awaiting later in the year data from the 2021 census. But we would expect to find that the percentage of private rented accommodation has increased over the last 10 years for reasons which I'm sure are very, very apparent to you all, the high cost of housing and the popularity of people wanting to rent in an inner London borough for reasons of work or lifestyle. We've done some consultation with both tenants and landlords in recent months. Tenants replied showing generally a high level of satisfaction with rented accommodation in Hammersmith and Fulham, but a significant number had some issues with their property. Those are summarised in Appendix 5 on page 19 of the report. It's actually the last page of the report, which has a summary of the results from private tenants. We also found in our current consultation, which is running at the moment until August, which is specifically about the licensing proposals, that a significant majority of tenants are in favour of landlord licensing, way up around 80%, possibly even more. And of course, in August, we will know the final score when the consultation period ends. Probably no great surprise to you to hear that landlords are much less keen on the idea of licensing, not least because there is a fee involved, but there may be other reasons why they are not in favour. Perhaps they think it's unnecessary, perhaps they think it's unnecessarily burdensome on landlords who already have a lot of financial and other liabilities as landlords. With regards to houses in multiple occupation, the licensing scheme licenses all houses in multiple occupation, including small ones. Large HMOs, as they're generally known, have to be licensed by national statute. So that's where they have 5 or more occupiers. So our additional HMO licensing scheme brings in the 3 and 4. So it brings in small HMOs. And although we found under the current scheme that many of them are in good condition and are very popular with their sharers who share them, there are quite a lot that don't have fire doors on kitchens. The smallest bedroom is really too small, less than 6.5 square meters, or that the kitchen is too small for the number of occupiers. And of course, there are a few rogue landlords, as they're usually known, who are really trying to cram too many occupiers into a small property. And we've been able to pick that up through the additional licensing. And just as a side issue, there are a number of flats in council freehold blocks. So they're ex-council flats, as people would often know them, which are now in private hands, having been purchased under leasehold, and are sublet to tenants. Nothing wrong with subletting in principle, but there are quite a large number that are sublet to sharers, which puts more people into the building than the building was designed for or used to occupy, puts pressure on the infrastructure of the building for waste management, for example, or noise. And sometimes there are alterations done to the interior of the flat which weren't approved by the council, which as a leaseholder, the leaseholder should have asked for approval. So just to finish, I'll just outline what the proposal is and then invite your questions. So June next year is the crucial date when the existing additional licensing for HMOs and selective licensing for certain streets comes to an end. And the proposal is to replace it with a virtually the same HMO scheme. So we carry on licensing HMOs, but to change the selective licensing scheme from its current model, which was based on data going back to 2014 to 17 at the absolute latest, which identified 128 streets. Now, many of those streets are very small, and when we've looked at them on more recent data, and we deliberately took our data up to March 2020 so that it wasn't skewed by coronavirus and lockdown and other issues that might have occurred in the last 12 months, we found that a lot of the small streets were no longer really of any great concern with regard to problems presented by the rented sector of litter, fly tipping or noise. So it's going to be much more sensible, we think, to concentrate on main roads, particularly where there are flats above shops or in connection with commercial premises. So we're going for 23 roads in the proposal, which is in Appendix 2, the list of the 23 roads. And you'll recognise nearly all of them, I expect, as some of the major roads in the borough with lots of rented properties above and around commercial. So the number of addresses in the scheme will remain roughly the same. It's just that we will be going for a smaller number of much larger streets, some of which are in the current scheme and a few of them aren't. HMO licensing, of course, is borough-wide. So in terms of coverage, the whole borough is covered by HMO licensing. The selective licensing streets are in a range of the borough's districts. I mean, I've just made a note that 9 of them are in W12, 1 is in NW10, that's Scrubs Lane. And then we've got 4 in W14, 4 in W6 and 5 in SW6. So there's a fair coverage, but with 9 of the 23 in the W12 district. And just picking up the issue of the council freehold blocks where leasehold flats are sublet to sharers, there's a proposal to do 2 things. One is where that block happens to be in a selective licensing street, we will make it a condition of the license that it is not used for multiple occupation. So doing so would then be a breach of the license, which is an offence. And if it's not in a selective licensing street, but the landlord applies for an HMO license, and that's happened to a very large number, several hundred in the current scheme, if they've got tenants in occupation, we will limit the license duration to 2 years and say within 2 years, we want them to either stop using it for multiple occupation or ask the housing department for a waiver to that policy to discourage HMO use. So that's a summary of the proposals. As I said, the public consultation started in May and runs until mid-August. And then we will look at the feedback in the consultation, look at it carefully and prepare some proposals for the relevant cabinet members with a view to them making a decision in December as to whether or not to proceed with this proposal in next June. So I'd be very, very happy to take any questions or feedback that you might have.
Are there any committee members who would like to ask Ed any questions? I will come to Councillor Brocklebank-Fowler first.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm slightly concerned, and perhaps I've misunderstood what you the last point that you made about the crossover. If someone has a house of multiple occupation and they happen to be in one of the reduced number of selective streets, you're saying that they're not allowed to be a house of multiple occupation. Is that right?
Yes, but if they've got tenants currently in place, we don't want to displace those tenants unnecessarily quickly. So we would give them a period of time, typically 2 years, and say within 2 years we wish it to cease to be a house in multiple occupation.
But these are on the main roads, and most of the streets you'll continue on, and they're basically all flats or big houses of multiple occupation. I mean, I can think of the Fulham Road. I mean, that is their raison d'etre. I mean, this is what they're used for.
Do you mean the whole? Do you mean the whole block?
Yes.
Yeah. Our proposals relate to the individual flats. So if a leaseholder of an individual flat has 3 people sharing, or possibly 4, they would have to apply for an HMO license. A selective license would actually be irrelevant in their case, because if they're already operating it as for multiple occupancy, which basically means 3 or more people who are not all related to each other, so typically 3 friends or even people who were strangers before they met and became occupiers, they would have to apply for an HMO license, because an HMO license trumps a selective license, if you like. And we would say within 2 years we would like them to stop using it for multiple occupation, because the council is the freeholder, so they have leasehold terms which they're expected to comply with.
So you're only talking about council properties, not privately owned properties?
In the context of that particular proposal, which is around ex-council flats, for want of a better word, that's what that specifically relates to. The scheme as a whole relates to all private landlords, whoever the freeholder of the property is. So the freeholder might be a private individual or a company. So
I think I've got it now. But moving on, the number, to have to register as an HMO with only 3 people living in a 3 or 4 bedroomed house or flat, of which there are, quite a substantial number, strikes me as being very low. I mean, it's too low a number. I mean, why does something like that have to change? Because it's the landlords who don't seem to be keen on this. Nearly everything they've responded to, is no, please don't. It costs too much. Go away.
You're right. There's a majority of landlords not in favour of us renewing the scheme. I think I've mentioned in the report 3/4 not in favour of
Yes.
selective licensing and 2/3 with HMOs. I mean, perhaps what I'm slightly surprised about is the reverse number, that as many as 1/4 either are in favour or don't mind, and 1/3 are in favour of HMO use. So we get a minority of landlords, quite a large minority in terms of 1/3, saying that they feel that regulation of their sector is actually a good thing because they're in competition with other landlords. I mean, to put it bluntly, the feedback I get when it's of the more frank and direct kind is I as a landlord are being undercut by a rogue landlord who's not complying with regulations, providing poor standard accommodation and charging a cheaper rent. You know, whereas I as a landlord are complying with everything I'm asked to comply with, and I'm paying the license fee, and I charge a bit more because I have to cover my costs. So there is a substantial number of landlords that do favour licensing because they feel that it regulates their sector better and makes it easier for councils to tackle rogue landlords. And it certainly does make it easier for us because by default, every landlord that doesn't apply for a licence, as they should, is the potential rogue landlord, for want of a better phrase. So we will go and ask people, and of course there are people who've forgotten to apply for a licence, or perhaps they say they never knew that the licensing scheme existed. And if we think they're telling the truth, then of course we take a sympathetic view and we advise them about the scheme and invite them to apply for a licence within 21 days. But if we think a landlord is evading us, then it's easier to home in on them if we already know the landlords that have succeeded in obtaining a licence. Your point was 3 people is quite small.
Yes.
There is a question in the consultation asking people if they think we should license all HMOs, including 3-person HMOs, or just 4-person HMOs. I mean, of course, there's a wider question whether we should license 3 or 4-person HMOs at all and just leave it to the national definition, which is 5.
Yeah.
The difficulty for us is a practical one, because if we say you've got to license a 4-person HMO but not a 3-person, we're going to find a lot of people telling us that they've got 3 occupiers when they might actually have 4. And it's going to be very difficult to actually work out which is which. So although I do sympathise with the point, and I understand it, that a 2-bedroom flat, say, with a couple in one room and a single person in the other, perhaps doesn't really look like a traditional HMO.
No.
But if you've got 2 couples sharing a 2-person HMO, then you've got 4. So it becomes very difficult to actually enforce if we draw that distinction, rather than saying all sharer flats and houses must be licensed.
But why do you want to go further than the national figure of 5? I mean, why do you want to at all? I mean, why is it?
Yeah. The 5-person ones we've been licensing since 2006, so we've either got them already under license, or when they come along, they're very large and easy to spot, if you like. These 3- and 4-person sharer houses and flats would be very difficult to spot if we didn't have a licensing scheme and people were required to license them. And we are finding that quite a lot of them are overcrowded. The rooms are very small, kitchens are very small, and landlords in some cases are trying to squeeze, in the example I just gave, a couple in one bedroom and a single person in the other. That's not a living situation that I particularly recognise, but I think I'm probably showing my age. But in the modern day, some younger people go for this model, and some landlords will put 1 couple in each bedroom, so you've got 2-bedroom flat with four adults occupying, and the lack of fire doors on kitchens is quite worrying. So the reason is to raise the standards of these much smaller houses and flats which have come onto the sharer market in recent years, which probably never used to be on the sharer market. They were occupied by families or 1 or 2 people, but the market rents are now so high that people are accepting much more confined accommodation than they would have thought acceptable several years ago.
Thank you.
Councillor Rosenberg, I wasn't sure, did you have a question, or was the hand raised from the previous item?
Called a legacy hand, I apologise.
Not to worry. Councillor Cassidy.
Thanks very much. And yeah, thanks again for the presentation. That was very helpful. A few questions. I suppose my first thing was just a little bit of a worry about the consultation, in that only 78 tenants have responded. And I mean, I know public consultations like this are incredibly difficult at the best of times to get responses from, but 78 does seem very low given the size of the private rented sector in Hammersmith and Fulham. I mean, what can be done to try to expand that to get more people to respond, especially tenants?
No, I recognise that point, because it was apparent from the very first few weeks of the consultation that we were getting lots of replies from landlords and fewer replies from tenants, and that wasn't unexpected. You know, we recognised that that was perhaps likely to be the case for possibly fairly obvious reasons, that landlords who are not very keen on licensing schemes were anxious to get their views made. We've gone to the tenant representative organisations, of which there are several these days. They're listed in the report under the consultation section. And I'm asking my officers who are involved in environmental health work with tenants looking at housing hazards and failure to license, that when they meet tenants for the last few weeks and for the next month or so, to encourage them to participate in the consultation. But I think it's interesting that we delivered 13,000 leaflets, not we personally, we commissioned a company to do it for us, in the selective licensing streets to the occupiers, and we've still only had the 78 replies. So there's a general bit of apathy about responding to council consultations. And we are trying to increase the number of responses we get from tenants by asking them directly to complete the consultation, in addition to that general publicity that we did earlier in the period.
Thanks very much. I think, I mean, I had a few things that were interesting from it. I mean, one of the things that jumps out as being really alarming on well, what's page 39 of the agenda, it's the idea, has your landlord given you a current gas safety certificate? That's 27% of tenants say no. I mean, that's incredibly worrying, but I don't know if it's very surprising. I suppose one of the things I wanted to find out, or wanted to get your thoughts on, maybe sort of chimes with my experience as a tenant, and certainly the experience of quite a few people I know who rent in London. And I would say nobody I know, aside from maybe one or two people on very rare occasions, nobody I know has ever really been a tenant of a rogue landlord, in the sense of somebody who was willfully out to be a crook of some sort, whether it was filling a property full of loads of students, or willfully ignoring repairs and things like this. What was a problem, and it's a problem I've experienced with landlords, is the terminology I've heard used sometimes is that of accidental landlords. So not somebody who has gone out to be a professional landlord, has professionally invested in properties and maybe works through an agent or something, but the common scenario I've encountered, and people I know who rent have encountered, is that of somebody who's maybe inherited a property, or they lived in their flat when they lived in London as a young married couple in the 1970s, and they now live outside of London, and lo and behold, their flat in old rundown Fulham is now worth huge amounts of money, and they rent it out. And what I've tended to find, certainly my experience of other people I know, is that they're not rogues, they're not trying to be bad landlords, but they very often just don't know what they're meant to be doing. They don't know enough about the rules and regulations. And I've had landlords like that, and I've had landlords in that who are not rogues, but yet we didn't get a gas safety certificate. The deposit wasn't properly protected. The repairs took a bit longer than you would expect to be carried out. And I just wanted to get a feeling from you, through the licensing that we've had thus far in the borough, have you had a feeling how many landlords like that exist? Not rogue landlords, not people out to willfully cause problems or break laws or you know, act in a negative way towards tenants, but people who don't know the rules and maybe a little bit unsure of what they're doing, aren't quite aware of their responsibilities as a private landlord, and sometimes, maybe more often than we'd like, fall foul of the law. Is that a significant issue? And how does landlord licensing help with that? Does that give these people a bit of a wake-up call that they have to act a bit more professionally than they maybe have been doing?
Yes, thanks for that point. And you're absolutely right. Landlords come in a wide range of types. There's no single typology for a landlord, and they can be everything from somebody who's very mature in age, who's renting a property that they've rented for many, many decades, through to a sort of entrepreneurial person who's acquired a building and done a massive conversion into studio flats, and everything in between. To put it very simply, if I can, of all the properties which have been licensed under the current scheme, which is close to 6,000, I couldn't put a figure on it because I don't know what the figure is, but a very substantial number were unaware, for example, that you should have a fire door and a kitchen if you put tenants into the property. And as the example you gave, that they should be giving the gas safety certificate to all their tenants, and any number of those other indications on page 19 of the report where tenants highlighted the problem. So the advantage of licensing schemes is that it makes it very clear to those landlords at the point that they find out about the licensing scheme and their obligations, what the conditions are in the license, which are quite long. There's about 28 conditions, and there's a set of amenity standards for both selectives and HMOs, because they're different, of course, on the council's website and available on request, which we give to the landlords. As well as that, we'll give people advice over the phone or by email, and in the old days we probably would have met them in person. We might even have done a house visit. We'll probably go back to that one day, but obviously not just right now. But and we can raise standards in that way by educating people and bringing them up to scratch. And we're not looking to enforce against people like that. There wouldn't be any need, because they're willing to cooperate, and even if they're not, they're aware of their responsibilities when we point it out to them. And I did say it was a simple answer. My second point is rogue landlords don't apply for licenses. So once we know that there's a property out there which is not licensed and it should be, then our antenna are ringing that the landlord might be deliberately avoiding us. It's not necessarily the case. There are plenty that got their head in the sand for some reason, or they just, what particularly annoys us is when we know they've got properties in lots of different boroughs or different parts of the country, and they don't bother to look on the council's website where the flat is to find out if there's a licensing scheme. Seems like a pretty poor excuse for someone who's a portfolio landlord, let alone a managing agent. But of course, there are people that need to be just brought up to speed. But yeah, to put it at risk of generalising, rogue landlords are not the ones applying for licenses. So it's almost like we're dealing with two different sets of people. The people who've applied for a licence and they need the benefit of our advice to bring them up to speed, and those which are trying to avoid us, which may be for fairly obvious reasons.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. Just with the indulgence of the chair, just one final point.
Carry on.
What was interesting, the experience of the limited number of local authorities in England that had borough-wide licensing. I think Newham is one. Obviously, I think the Secretary of State and the government's attitude to borough-wide licensing has changed since they were able to sneak in their applications for whole borough licensing. Newham's one experience, and Newham had an interesting experience where they shared their data with HMRC and came up with a slightly intriguing figure that potentially around half of their landlords were not declaring their rental income to HMRC. Potentially half of the landlords in that borough were trying to avoid tax. Have we done anything similar in terms of sharing data with other government agencies, whether it be HMRC or anybody else? Because obviously that was I don't know if the experience would be similar in Hammersmith and Fulham, but that was a fairly shocking figure from Newham that such a high proportion of their landlords were potentially not declaring income. Is that something we've done or are thinking of doing?
I mean, I've been in Hammersmith and Fulham since February last year, so about a year and a half, and that hasn't happened during that time. But what I do know happens from time to time is that HMRC actually send round a request of all local authorities to send in their registers, because one of the things, it would be easy enough for us to have a register anyway, but councils are obliged to keep a full-on register of licensed HMOs and selective licensing, and HMRC can send round asking us to send it in. So it's as much a question of whether HMRC have at that time got the resources to do an investigation, and they may pick on certain local authorities at certain times to do it. I'm not aware of councils which have done it proactively apart from the Newham example, and it's something I would take guidance on from the administration and the senior leadership team, because we are trying to build good relations with landlords, and we don't want to destroy that in one fell swoop if they all got the impression we were trying to dob them in for tax.
Thank you very much.
Ed, could I come back to you and just ask about, I was really intrigued and thought that the criteria for which streets were being selected sort of made a lot of sense. But I was wondering, there's quite often concern both from sort of residents and sort of people moving into these places on properties which were formerly shops and sort of commercial sites, particularly on the sort of street level that weren't traditionally residential, that have been converted, some with more success than others. Quite a few of the streets that you've that are in the report are actually in that area, so I know it's covered, but I wondered whether there was a way of actually also in the future actually including or sort of targeting the select licensing to properties in areas which aren't on our radar, but which might have that concern of needing, or sort of it would benefit from our licensing because of the change of use.
Yes, and one of the options for a selective licensing scheme is how you define which properties are included. As Councillor Cassidy rightly said, the whole borough schemes are being frowned upon by government at the moment, so we're going for a 20% scheme, which the council is authorised to create on its own. We've gone for streets because one thing you have to do is make it clear to everybody what's in and what's not in the scheme. But of course, one of the options, as you say, is to define a type of property rather than the street or location that it's in. I mean, I think we're quite unusual because we've gone for actual streets. Most boroughs that I look at, they go for wards. And that's a bit of a blunt tool because you can have a very wide range of types of property within the same ward. I think the point is well made. I agree with the principle that if you were to generalise a type of property which is more likely to cause a problem, we have certainly said flats above shops and flats behind or around commercial. I think you're identifying properties that used to be commercial and have now changed use. It's certainly worth considering, provided we can just make it clear to everybody what's included in the scheme and what isn't.
Yes, I mean, I'm thinking there are some properties, it's actually covered in your area, but Dalling Road in my ward in Ravenscourt Park has a number of properties that clearly used to be sort of shops or offices in the past and have been converted to residential now. And, you know, there are always concerns over how appropriate they are. Some of them you can almost sort of see into people's sort of living space because they've still got the floor to ceiling windows of when it used to be an accountant's or, you know, a solicitor's office and is now residential and so on. But I can think of, just off the top of my head, other roads that aren't covered, that weren't specified in your report, but have a similar type that may, you know, benefit from being part of the select licensing.
No, I think it's a point very well made. And in the last few months, whilst we've been preparing for this proposal, so going back to last October, we've had officers doing street surveys, up and down the streets, perhaps more than we've done in the past, specifically to sort of look for properties that appear to be problematic. And that's one of the ways that we've kind of honed down on this set of 23, because to put it, simply, the officers have come back and said, yes, I've been down that road and it definitely needs to be in the scheme. Or I've had a walk up and down that road, I've spoken to some residents, I've looked at the data and I really can't see a problem. So yeah, where you've got that type of commercial conversion, definitely of interest, either as a licensable property, although of course there's nothing to stop us making a Housing Act inspection anyway, because we still have those powers, quite aside from licensing, which of course we haven't spoken about today because it's not part of the subject. But we've got powers to inspect housing conditions, usually on reports from a tenant, but even if we haven't got a report, we can still make inquiries.
Okay, thank you, very helpful. Okay, I think that's the end of all the questions, so thank you very much, Ed. We will move on to the next item on our agenda, which is the licensing policy consultations. So I will ask Adrian Overton to introduce this item.
Apologies, Chair. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. I'm just going to try and share my screen, so bear with me a moment. I'm more used to Teams than I am to Zoom, so 1 second. I'll try and share this. I don't know if everybody can see that now.
Yes, it looks like we can, yes. Yeah.
Put it in the presentation view, 1 second. Okay, is that still visible to everybody?
Yes, it looks like it's on the first page.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Right, let me just try and... Okay, excellent. All right, so good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Adrian Overton and I'm the Licensing Policy and Enforcement Manager at Hammersmith and Fulham. I'm going to be going through a couple of slides this evening just in relation to 2 live consultations for the future of the cumulative impact policies in the borough, and that's Hammersmith, that's Fulham, and that's Shepherd's Bush, and for the review, the statutory review of our statement of gambling policy. Both consultations, as you would imagine, are taking place electronically on citizen space in line with our environmental commitments. The cumulative impact policy, first of all, expires on the 27th of August, and the review of our statement of gambling policy consultation expires on the 19th of September. So I'm just checking that's gone on to the next slide correctly, yeah?
It has, yeah.
Thank you very much. So turning to the cumulative impact consultation, first of all, just to give you some background on cumulative impact policies in general and the way that we've used them in Hammersmith and Fulham in the past anyway. So with the first point, cumulative impact policies were introduced as a tool for licensing authorities to limit the growth of licensed premises in problem areas. The Fulham policy, by way of background, was first introduced in 2009, and after this, the Shepherd's Bush policy was introduced in 2011. And although they're both cumulative impact policies, they have different reasons, and there's different evidence bases for both of the policies. And so they're both introduced essentially to tackle different issues. So the Shepherd's Bush policy was primarily introduced to try and tackle street drinking issues, which were fueled by large numbers of off licenses in the area. And the Fulham policy tried to tackle large numbers of vertical drinking establishments in that particular area, many of which have now changed to different types of premises or have now closed or altered their operation. So in relation to point 2, if as a licensing authority we receive clusters of complaints and we can see that there are issues in certain areas, and that's as a result of cumulative impacts of licensed premises within the area concerned, this is normally tackled by way of an evidential study. So in summary, cumulative impact is the potential adverse impact on any of the 4 licensing objectives that you can see there by having too many licensed premises in one area. So this, the next slide essentially shows a basic route from the top to the bottom for the introduction of a cumulative impact policy, and what stages we need to go through to introduce a cumulative impact policy. So it's very important to see if there are issues with one or two licensed premises, or if there are actually issues with clusters of licensed premises. And if there are issues with isolated premises, then they should be dealt with you know, on a case-by-case basis, and not by the introduction of an overall policy. This issue should obviously be raised with the operator first of all, and then via, you know, formally, and then via enforcement methods if required afterwards. If it seems that a CIP, a cumulative impact policy, is required, we do need to look at our existing data, and we need to speak to the police and other responsible authorities first of all to see what evidence they've got, and see if we could move forward with evidential gathering for a cumulative impact policy. Any evidence gathering study or cumulative impact assessment is best backed up by a third party study as well. So although this can be costly, and I think we may have mentioned this in our report, I think it's really beneficial. If you can imagine, if we make a decision on cumulative impact, and if it is appealed, and if it goes to a magistrate's court, they may ask, you know, how has this evidence been collected? And whilst we might say, well, you know, council officers have collected it, if we can also point to a third party study who've got no reason to back up our evidence, then that's all the better. So it's always best if we back out by a third party study. And once we have this initial information, we could form an idea on the geographical boundaries for potential policy zones, and then we could start to consult on those areas. Ultimately, any new cumulative impact policy, any new cumulative impact policy or amendments to current cumulative impact policies, or the removal, most importantly, because what we're concerning at the moment, needs to be agreed at full council. So if we can see at the moment, this is the Fulham Broadway cumulative impact policy area. And if I could, I don't know if you can see that on the screen as I'm moving my cursor around, but you can see that the blue line sort of indicates where the policy is actually in effect at the moment. And you can see it covers Chelsea Football Club, and it covers parts of North End Road and Fulham Broadway, etc. And it may be that those areas don't need to be covered. It may be that there's, you know, we don't have evidence that there's issues with Chelsea Football Stadium and the roads very close by to Chelsea Football Stadium. And again, we can see the Shepherd's Bush cumulative impact area as it is at the moment. And we did have evidence when we first introduced the policy that there were antisocial behaviour issues further up Uxbridge Road, further down Goldhawk Road, and the connection with Askew Road. I think the initial look at evidence now shows that the antisocial behaviour issues are really circulated around the green and don't extend as far up as Askew Road. So that's something that I think we're going to be very mindful of, because obviously by having such a large area, we are encompassing these large areas of residential premises in the middle that possibly don't have any issues with cumulative impact. So, as explained in the evidence gathering for any policy, it must be reviewed every 3 years. The current evidence for our policy unfortunately expired in April this year, and since that time we've been very careful not to make any decisions based on our current policies. We have, however, made decisions based on cumulative impact in general, and in some instances where these problems were raised by local residents, we've always been very clear in our decisions that, in our decision letters, that the policies were not relied on when we've made these decisions. So, say for example, a resident may have said, you know, I'm aware of a number of licensed premises, and I think that they're adding to the general cumulative impact in this particular area. So we're able to take that into account, but we didn't say, well, actually, we've made a decision on our policy, because we were conscious since April that obviously that evidence has expired. We are, as you can imagine, we were hoping to gather evidence in 2020 so we could renew our existing policies. However, the pandemic meant that this was impossible. Obviously, there's any evidence that we gathered wouldn't have shown a true picture of how the hospitality sector was operating in the daytime or in the evening either. So in terms of sources of evidence, responsible authorities, the police, environmental health, etc., residents, local councillors are also very important sources of evidence, as with any evidence gathering study, as mentioned previously. The types of evidence that we collect include local crime stats and hotspots, antisocial behaviour stats, public health related statistics, alcohol related hospital admissions, etc. So there really is a broad range of evidence that we collect to try and shore up any policy that we would introduce. Other factors that we would consider, there's certainly trends in applications that we found in recent times. So say, for example, in the last probably 18 months to 2 years, we found a lot of pop-up venues. So venues that are licensed for festivals or just, for small periods of time, or have time limited license just for a year, etc. And obviously in line with the government's encouragement for off sales and for people to drink outdoors, we've seen an awful lot of off sales where every on sale premises has actually been entitled to have off sales. We don't know how long that permission is going to extend, but it's obviously completely changed the dynamic of the daytime and the nighttime economy dramatically. And then we've got changes in terminal hours of premises. We've seen a lot of, I would say probably in the last 5 years, we've seen a lot of preloading before people go out into the nighttime economy, mainly because of the price point of alcohol later on in the evening. So people are consuming a lot of alcohol earlier on and then going out. So it's, trying to consider whether cumulative impact policies are able to tackle that issue. And then we've got different capacities at different times of night. This was particularly highlighted during COVID, where people would have different sittings at some venues throughout the day and throughout the evening to get around the certain capacity issues. And then we've got, concentrations of drinkers leaving licensed premises at different times. All of these, I mean, when people are asked to leave licensed premises, that has a massive knock-on effect. And it's about deciding when those customers are still the responsibility of the licensed premises, or when they have their own responsibilities as well. So as you can see, the consultation, as I mentioned earlier on, is live, and we would encourage you to pass on the link to anyone that you think may want to contribute to the consultation. And as I said, it closes on the 27th of August. I don't know whether it's helpful, but before I move on to the gambling policy review, I didn't know whether anybody wanted to make any comments on this part of my presentation while it's still fresh in their minds.
Yes, are there any committee members who would like to specifically talk about or ask questions on the cumulative impact policy before we move on to gambling? Councillor Brocklebank-Fowler.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Adrian, thank you for that. I, as you well remember, was chairman of licensing between 2008 to 2012, when these two cumulative impact zones came into effect. And from that perspective, it was absolutely essential for our borough to have both of those zones. And so I am very keen that they're renewed. And so perhaps I can direct a question to Councillor Harcourt as to the administration's intention on this consultation. Are they supporting it or not?
Councillor Harcourt, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we're supporting the consultation.
Okay, you're supporting the consultation, but what results are you hoping for from the consultations?
I think it's as the government says, let the data decide. That's the purpose of the consultation. If the consultation comes out that there's still, a desire and a need for the cumulative impact areas, then that's what we'll do. If it comes back they need changing, that they need reducing in areas in aerial location, as Adrian has indicated, then that will be it as well. So let's see what the consultation says.
Okay.
I'm absolutely not against them.
No, I'm just slightly surprised because obviously you've kept renewing them up until now. and I have been approached by a number of people who've been concerned at the language that was used, because it kind of implied that they weren't essential policies.
No, I mean, the situation is that, as we've heard tonight, we have to go renew the license the policy every 3 years, and we need to consult and gather evidence. For obvious reasons, last year, with half the hospitality, pubs and whatnot all shut, any evidence gathering would have given a totally false picture during COVID. So we found ourselves stuck, which is why they've policy has expired. That's the only reason behind it. Nothing more subtle than that.
No, okay, I completely get that. It's just that when you are making decisions like that, as you well know, having sat on licensing yourself, of course, it is a really important tool to have, because these areas really need a bit of control. And it's unlike me to sort of say things like that, but in this case, I really strongly believe that the borough would be much worse off if we didn't have them.
Okay, well, I take your point. I am aware of the issues that still exist, certainly in Shepherd's Bush, around Shepherd's Bush Green, and I was certainly aware of what the problems that existed down in Fulham town centre.
Yes.
How they've changed, I think I really want to see the evidence. At the moment, things do change. I'm aware that that the problems still do exist, but at the same time, now that we've got so-called Freedom Day, how is that going to affect the response? I don't know. So I really want to see what happens and see what people have to say. I really, it's not me sitting here saying, yes, we want to continue with them, or no, we want to abandon them. It's a question of really the purpose of the consultation is to find out where we are at the moment, and especially given the situation that we've seen. I think you saw on the news last night queues of people trying to get into a nightclub. Whether if we're going to start getting queues of people going into pubs and all sorts of antisocial behaviour associated with it, then obviously we need to take action on that. But equally, if everything's hunky-dory and there's no problem whatsoever, then it might be time to relax it. So, as I say, let the data direct us.
Okay.
Councillor,
I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor. If it might help to clarify, I think there's really two reasons for this consultation as well. It's really to consult on the removal of the current policies from our overall licensing policy, which technically we have to do because the evidence has expired, and also just generally more widely about the future of cumulative impact policies in Hammersmith and Fulham. Are they useful? Do we still want to use them? Do we need to change the geographical area, or do we want to remove them completely? And we've already gathered quite a lot of good information from residents. Quite a few people have started providing their comments on the consultation.
Yes.
So we'll obviously consider all of those when we make our decision. But what I would say is, in the interim period, before new policies are considered, we can't rely on the policies to make decisions. We have to rely on general cumulative impact, as we have done in the past with some decisions, to say, yes, we think there are issues, but we can't point to evidence that we've gathered because we weren't able to gather that evidence, unfortunately.
Yes, I completely understand that, Adrian, and that's very helpful. And obviously, because things are only just kind of opening up, it is going to be more difficult for you to collect immediate evidence. I mean, there are obviously people who will report, but the consultation's only running, till the 27th of August. It's not a very long time. Well, why is it a statutory length of time, or?
It's not. We are able to reduce or be flexible with the consultation time. So, because we thought it was more of a technical consultation in terms of just removing the policies that are outdated, seeing as the evidence has gone. We felt that 8 weeks was a good length of time for that. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
No problem at all. If there's
Thank
no more
you.
questions, no problem at
Yes,
all.
I was just going to ask whether there's any other questions on this particular item from any other members of the committee. I'm not seeing any, so please feel free. Are you also presenting the gambling policy? Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Yes, I was going to move on to that next. Yeah.
Yes, please do.
Thank you. Right, I'm not sure if everybody can see that as well. So,
yeah, it's moved. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. So, yeah, just in relation to the review of the council's statement of gambling policy, this is a standard review, a standard consultation, if you like, and something that we have to conduct every 3 years. What we do like to do is when we're reviewing the statement of gambling policy, we do like to offer suggestions, because obviously, we appreciate that everybody's not an expert in the field of gambling or licensing. So obviously we look around at other authorities, what other ideas are, other trends are, and we do like to offer those up in our questionnaire and put those forward to residents, stakeholders, other responsible authorities to see if that's an item of interest, to almost generate debate, so that we can maybe get some more responses to the consultation. And that's what we've done this time. That's what we've done this time around as well. So, so as it says here, I mean, the council's current statement of gambling policy expires in January 2022. And with this in mind, we've recently started the consultation. Some of the considerations that we will be taking into account as part of this review include changes to the gambling regime, the promotion of the 3 licensing objectives, the guidance issued under Section 25 of the Gambling Act 2005. And this does change quite a lot. So obviously we've looked at some of the wording in the policy and we've changed that around. So I don't want to go through that in detail with you this evening, but you'll be able to see that online. And we've actually produced a document with track changes so you can see what's been removed and what's been changed. We've also considered our current 2019 statement of gambling policy, local crime prevention measures, and Equalities Act, obviously 2010. And then we've also, thought about the council's commitment to the nighttime economy. So as you can see here, this is a local area profile that we've had produced to give us some initial data, and it will probably, well, I think it will definitely help with one of the suggestions that we've made in relation to adult gaming centres, where we've suggested that essentially the current default Gambling Act 2005 times for adult gaming centres is 24 hours, and we've thought for a long time, and the police licensing team have fed into us and said that actually there's lots of crime associated with these premises later in the evening. So we've made a policy suggestion that these premises should be closed at 11 o'clock. And I think, excuse me, as you can probably see from the map here, which is, or it is a heat map, so you can see the darker the colours, there's more associations with ASB. So you can certainly see that in Shepherd's Bush, and in Hammersmith, that there's more issues with ASB, where there are clusters of adult gaming centres and clusters of betting shops as well. So that will obviously form part of our evidence gathering. In terms of the no casino resolution, this is something that we've had in our policy for some time since it was introduced, since the gambling policy was introduced, since our first policy. So the Gambling Act 2005 makes provision for 3 types of casino: small, large, and regional, otherwise known as a super casino. There's limits on the number of casinos: 8 small, 8 large, and 1 regional, as you can see there. And the allocation for casinos has already been taken up. So the law needs to change if we want further allocations of casinos. And we have, since we've had our first policy, we've adopted and continue to adopt and re-adopt a no casino resolution every 3 years. As you can imagine, the no casino resolution applies to the whole borough. And once this resolution is adopted, it must be placed within the council statement of gambling policy. We have asked this time, we've put a specific question in there, and we've asked if we should continue with this resolution or if we should consider removing it to better reflect the council's commitment to the nighttime economy. So that's a suggestion. I think as it happens, we wouldn't be able to have, because the national limit for the casinos is already exceeded, but it's something that we thought we could ask residents to see what they think. We understand that obviously the nighttime economy is one of our our key commitments. So we wanted to ask that question, and we'll obviously be interested to see what the outcome of that question is. So yes, as with the cumulative impact policy, our consultation is now live, and it ends on the 19th of September. We would encourage you to pass this link on to anyone you think who may want to contribute. It has been sent out to all councillors, so you should all have a link, electronic link to the cumulative impact policy and to the gambling policy. But please drop an email to licensing if you don't have this, and we can send this over to you. I don't have anything else to add, Chair, unless you have any questions.
Okay, I'm sure it's not important to anyone else, but the gambling policy was the first thing that we looked at in my first PAC when I took over chairing this committee. So it's a place dear to my heart, but as I said, I'm sure it's not that important to anybody else. Are there any questions? I've got a couple myself, but I'm happy to let other members of the committee go first. Councillor Brockback-Fowler, yes.
Thank you, Adrian, for that. I think the suggestion about closing at 11, backed up by the police evidence, is a very good idea, and I think you could argue that it has a health aspect to it. I mean, there are all kinds of. Anyway, I think that's a very good idea. Obviously, as you can imagine, I'm 100% supportive of the no casino situation, and I don't think it's suitable for this borough, and I still don't. I don't think there's any reason why it would be of any help in any way, and I will be filling in the consultation.
That's great. Thank you very much, Councillor. Yeah, no, I would definitely suggest that you do, just to formalise those comments. That would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it might not hurt to either for myself or Adrian, maybe from your office, to actually resend out the details of that consultation to councillors. It may have dropped off people's priority list, but given the social impact and ASB implications of gambling venues in the borough, I think it's something that's worth resending out and reminding while there's adequate time for councillors to take a look at things. I wanted to ask, with regards to the consultation, I noted that there are sort of a lot of relevant organisations that we're liaising with and consulting, you know, from the police force, residents association, etc., and including safeguarding organisations. One thing I didn't see, and correct me if I'm wrong, was actually any gambling charities. So I know that, as I said, they're safeguarding. I was wondering whether it might actually be worth speaking. I mean, even if they weren't specifically consulting on our area, you know, Hammersmith and Fulham, they might not have the expertise, or there might be general principles that gambling charities have with relation to venues that I don't know if that's included already. So yeah, that was my first question.
Yeah, just in answer to that question, it hasn't been actually, but no, that's certainly something that we can send around the link to those charities and make them aware. Certainly, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that will be helpful. And then the other thing was, again, this might be because it's not relevant in our borough because it doesn't occur, but I noticed that the gambling, it looked like the policy relates to, so for gambling machines, it doesn't seem to apply to sort of the one-off standalone machines. It only seems to apply to sort of two or more. Is that because we don't have standalone sort of single machines in hospitality, like cafes and pubs?
So you can have a permit for machines like you might see in a pub or a restaurant, etc. And because the entitlement is for two machines, people tend to take advantage of both machines, if you see what I mean.
Right.
So rather than just have the one machine. So yes, it does. I think there is something in there about those entitlements as well within the policy at the moment. Yes. Okay,
I just wanted to check there aren't sort of standalone machines that aren't sort of, that are slipping through our policy and operating outside of those parameters, and possibly, you know, people being exposed to, you know, vulnerable people being exposed to them.
No, that's something that's taken into account in the policy.
Okay,
definitely.
great.
Yeah, 100%.
Right, okay. Did anybody else on the committee have any questions regarding the gambling policy? No. Okay. In that case, as I said, if we just, as I said, I'll make a note and say I think it would be good to resend out the consultation details to the wider group of councillors, just that they are reminded of the importance of contributing if possible.
No problem at all. I can do that. It's fine. No problem.
Great. Okay,
Thank you.
so we've noted and commented on that report. Thank you very much. Okay, that brings us to the close of tonight's informal meeting. Thank you, everyone, particularly as I know that I'm sure we're all swell, unless you have the advantage of being somewhere air conditioned. Unfortunately, I don't, so I'm sort of sitting here sweltering myself. Our next meeting, I believe, is not actually until October. What I would like to do with regards to upcoming work planning, I think we need to find out, obviously, what the public health situation is, whether we'll be meeting online informally, or hopefully, as it said, either in person or online in a more formal capacity, so we can actually conduct formal business, which we weren't able to do tonight. Therefore, I suggest that we either have a committee Zoom meeting just to maybe discuss the work programme in September, and I think we'll have a better idea of in what format we're meeting. And in the meantime, if there are things that committee members would like to see discussed, please do email them through to both me and Amrita, who is the clerk for the committee, and then we can have a look at them against other items that we will be looking at in the upcoming year.
Okay.
If that's everything, I would like to thank everyone again, and also please stay healthy. I hope everyone's had the opportunity to have their jabs, and if I don't speak to you or see you otherwise, please have a fantastic summer, or as fantastic a summer as you can in the circumstances. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.